I'd planned this solo journey weeks in advance, just me, my backpack, and the promise of a quiet weekend in the mountains. The kind of trip that gave me the peace I needed, away from work, away from the noise of everyday life. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies, so I didn't bother packing extra rain gear. I was optimistic, ready for the solitude of nature. I arrived at the trailhead around mid morning, the sun already climbing high, scattering light across the dense woods. The parking lot was mostly empty, only one other car, a dusty old SUV, was parked near the entrance. It seemed like the perfect time to start my hike. Quiet, untouched. I slung my pack over my shoulder, double checked my water, and made sure I had everything I needed: snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone, although I wasn't expecting to need it. The trail ahead of me was wide and welcoming, flanked by tall pines on either side, their branches heavy with needles. The earth smelled fresh, like wet moss, and the distant chirp of birds was the only sound that filled the air. I loved that. As I walked, I focused on the rhythm of my boots crunching over the dirt path, the light breeze on my skin, the sense of being far removed from the world. Time seemed to slow out here. The trail wasn't overly difficult, a moderate incline with some rocky patches, but nothing that would require more than basic effort. I passed the first mile marker and kept going, my mind wandering as I hiked. The further I went, the more isolated it felt. The trail seemed to grow quieter, the trees taller and more densely packed. Occasionally, I'd look up and spot a flash of movement in the branches, a bird, perhaps, or a squirrel, but otherwise, everything was still. There was something peaceful about it, but also something unnerving. The silence in nature can be comforting, but it can also make you aware of the smallest sound, amplifying every step you take, every shift in the leaves. I had planned on reaching the summit by afternoon, but I wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't about the destination for me, it was about the journey. After another hour or so, I reached a fork in the trail. The signs were clear enough, one leading toward a steep, rocky incline that went straight up the mountain, the other winding toward a lower pass that curved around the side. I debated for a moment, but the higher path called to me. I liked the challenge of the climb. The rocks were loose in some places, making it more difficult than I anticipated. I took my time, using my hands to steady myself against the uneven surface. The higher I climbed, the more the forest began to thin out and the view grew broader. I could see the valley below, the winding river, the small patchwork of farms in the distance. For a moment, I stood there, just breathing in the view, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. But then, a strange feeling came over me. It wasn't fear, exactly, just a sense of being watched. I couldn't shake it. I glanced around, but there was nothing. No sign of movement, no sound that shouldn't be there. It was just the woods, the wind rustling the trees. Still, the feeling lingered. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just my mind playing tricks. I pressed on. As I neared the summit, the path narrowed and the rocks grew more jagged. The air felt thinner up here, colder, despite the sun. The wind was picking up, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. It wasn't unusual for the weather to shift quickly in the mountains, especially this high up. Still, Something about the change in temperature unsettled me. It felt wrong. I reached the top shortly after, wind whipped and out of breath. I stood there for a while, taking in the view. The valley below seemed like a different world, entirely quieter, smaller. The sun had started to dip a little lower in the sky, casting everything in a golden glow. But as beautiful as it was, I couldn't shake that creeping feeling from earlier. That sensation of being I never thought I'd be the kind of person to go camping alone. But something had been nagging at me for weeks, maybe even months. The feeling that I needed to escape the noise of everyday life, to get away from people, and just be alone for a while. It wasn't anything specific, just a general weight I couldn't shake off. So when I found a cabin in the woods that was available for rent, I decided to take the plunge. It was a secluded spot, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. Nothing too fancy, just a simple wooden cabin in the middle of a forest, no neighbors for miles. Perfect, I thought. Peaceful. I packed up my gear, tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, food, water, and the essentials, and drove out there on a Friday afternoon. The sun was still high in the sky, and the air was warm, but there was something in the stillness of the drive that started to make me uneasy. The further I went down the winding road, the fewer cars I passed, and the more I started to wonder if I was really making the right decision. But at that point, I was committed. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the place looked just like the pictures online, rustic, with dark wooden walls, a small porch, and tall pine trees surrounding it on all sides. It was exactly what I wanted, isolated. I stepped out of my car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and clean. There was no one else around. It was just me, the trees, and the silence. The cabin wasn't exactly new, but it looked well maintained. The front door creaked when I opened it, and the scent of old wood and dust greeted me. I took my bags inside and set up my things, unfolding the sleeping bag on the small cot in the corner, unpacking my food into the tiny kitchenette, and organizing my gear in the small closet. Everything seemed fine. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air cooled quickly. I went outside to start a small fire in the pit just behind the cabin. The sky darkened, and soon enough, the only light came from the campfire flickering in front of me. I sat by the fire, toasting a marshmallow and watching the flames dance. The forest felt peaceful, calm. Every so often, I would hear a branch crack in the distance, the rustle of leaves as an animal moved through the underbrush. But there was nothing that felt out of the ordinary. I stayed up for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. As the last of the orange glow flickered out, I felt that familiar chill in the air, a reminder that it was going to be a cold night. I headed inside, locked the door, and settled into bed. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something wasn't right. At first, I couldn't place it, just a feeling that something was off. I listened carefully to the silence, but all I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves outside the cabin. I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it was just me in the middle of the woods. There wasn't anyone else around, right? I lay back down and tried to go back to sleep, but it was hard to shake the feeling. It was as though the forest was watching me. The air was heavy, thick with an unsettling stillness. I told myself to relax, but my heart was racing a little faster than usual. Then I heard something outside the cabin, a noise, not the usual rustling of leaves, but something heavier, something that seemed to be walking around the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. My heart skipped a beat that I sat up in bed, straining my ears, trying to figure out what it was. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something bigger, like a bear, though I hadn't seen any tracks nearby. Still, the way it moved around the cabin felt purposeful. I grabbed the flashlight on the nightstand and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I got out of bed and slowly made my way to the window. The forest fits your request. The cabin in the woods. It started with an invitation. A simple message on my phone. Hey, you should come with us this weekend. We rented a cabin in the woods. Need to get away from everything. I was never much for nature, always more of a city person, but the thought of getting out of town and having some peace for a couple of days seemed nice. So I agreed. When I pulled up to the cabin, I wasn't impressed. It looked like something out of an old, forgotten movie, wooden, weathered, with a sagging porch and a single light flickering in the distance. The kind of place where the silence almost smothers you. My friends, Rachel and Ben, had already arrived. They were unloading the car, laughing, seemingly excited about the weekend. Glad you could make it, Rachel said, smiling at me as I stepped out of my car. Ben waved but didn't say much. I didn't realize it'd be this remote, I commented, squinting at the cabin. It was isolated, no neighbors in sight. Just trees, dense and thick, stretching in all directions. Yeah, that's the point, Ben said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. No distractions. Just us in the woods. I wasn't so sure about that. I had always been uneasy about places that felt too secluded. Maybe it was because I'd grown up in a city, surrounded by people and noise. Out here, it was just too quiet. Almost unnatural. Once inside, the cabin felt older than it looked from the outside. The wooden floors creaked under my feet, and the smell of mildew and damp would fill the air. There was a fireplace at one end of the room, a few mismatched chairs, and a worn-out couch in front of it. The kitchen area was small, with just enough room for a stove, a fridge, and a couple of cabinets. The only bathroom was tiny, tucked away in a corner, with a shower that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The whole place had this heavy, oppressive feel to it, like the walls were closing in. Ben and Rachel seemed to love it, though. They set their bags down and immediately started unpacking. I found a spot on the couch and sat down, looking around, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cabin, Rachel suggested we go for a walk. We should explore, she said. You can't come all the way out here and not check out the surroundings. I hesitated but decided to go along with it. After all, I wasn't going to sit around in that cabin all night. The woods were dense, with thick trees that blocked out most of the light. The air was cool and damp, and as we walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world outside seemed to fade away. There was only the crunch of leaves under our feet and the occasional rustle of branches. The further we went, the more oppressive the silence became. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt suffocating. Do you hear that? Ben suddenly asked, stopping in his tracks. He turned his head toward the trees, his expression tense. I listened, but I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. Just the wind and the occasional bird calling in the distance. Hear what? I asked, trying to calm my racing heart. Nothing. Maybe I imagined it, Ben muttered, shaking his head. But there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. We kept walking, but the weird feeling stuck with me. The woods seemed darker, more unsettling with each passing step. It felt like something was out there, watching us. But when I glanced around, all I could see were the same trees, the same twisted branches reaching toward the sky. After about an hour, we turned back, and the light was nearly gone. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, just a faint outline in the distance. We hurried back, eager to get inside, but something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the forest felt wrong now. It was like it had shifted, changed, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be there anymore. Back in the cabin, Rachel suggested we light a fire in the fireplace. It was already chilly, and the warmth would feel nice. Ben and I helped gather some firewood, and soon the flames crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The three of us settled into the living room, but there was this uneasy tension in the air, like we were all waiting for something. That night, after we went to bed, I couldn't sleep. The silence in the cabin was so deep, it pressed in on me. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind outside seemed to amplify. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A faint sound. It was a thumping noise, like something was tapping on the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. My first thought was that it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises. But the sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced at the door to the hallway. Ben's door was slightly ajar, but Rachel's was shut tight. I wasn't sure what to do, so I stayed still, straining to hear. The tapping grew louder, closer. I could almost feel it moving along the wall toward my room. I got out of bed, my legs shaky, and crept toward the door. I opened it just enough to peek into the hallway. The dim light from the living room cast long shadows across the floor. But there was nothing. No sign of movement. I thought about waking Ben, but something in my gut told me that wasn't a good idea. I wasn't sure why, but I had a feeling we were being watched. I closed my door slowly and locked it, then climbed back into bed, trying to ignore the growing feeling of dread. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found Ben and Rachel in the kitchen, acting normal. Ben was making coffee. Rachel was looking through the cupboards for something to eat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in the night. Something I couldn't explain. Did you guys hear anything last night? I